All right, and welcome to an overview of crisis decision making. My name is Matthew Bonvento. I'm going to be your host and your moderator. With me are Richard Olson and Reed Hodgin. Now, Reed is a 4 year professional whose background includes management and operational experience in crisis decision making, training development and delivery, emergency management and response, hazard and risk assessment, atmospheric modeling, meteorology, facilitation, and public process management, as well as a variety of other rich and wonderful, rewarding enterprises. Reed has led, participated in, and trained crisis decision making for more than 25 years. He has worked directly with and on the ground response teams to assess, train, and support the improvement of emergency and disaster making decision making. He is a principal investigator and lead scientist on the AlphaTrac system, an advanced simulation-based training capability that uses artificial intelligence to capture and apply the experiences of successful decision makers. Reed is currently leading a program to extend the principles of experience acceleration, knowledge transfer, and crisis decision making to the gas and electric industries. He graduated from Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1976 with a BS in atmospheric physics and is a certified consulting meteorologist. Rich Olson has been at Brookhaven National Lab since 2008, starting in the Office of Emergency Management. In 2019, he became the manager of nuclear materials management at BNL. Prior to that, Rich was the National Director for Domestic Disaster Preparedness and Response for the Episcopal Relief and Development, overseeing the Episcopal Church's response to disasters. Before that, he worked for the Department of Homeland Security, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and National Preparedness, and also had multiple disaster leadership roles, including Deputy Operations Section Chief for Federal Operations for FEMA's response to 9/11, and the Division Supervisor for the 8 hardest hit parishes in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. He has a Bachelor of Science from SUNY Maritime College and a Master's of Business from Norwich University. Your host, myself, Matthew, a degree in marine transportation. I spent many years working as a regulator for the Vanuatu Ship Registry, handling ship emergencies, accident investigation, and disaster relief. This series is going to be based upon our desire to enhance your knowledge of crisis decision-making, leadership decision-making, management, and things growing and experienced leaders both need to know in order to handle everyday items and crises. Reed is going to start us off by speaking about decision-making.
All right, so let's first talk for a moment about what is decision making. So we'll go through a practical definition for just a moment. First part of decision making is there must be a problem that has to be solved. For instance, an example of a kind of a trivial decision is what color socks should I wear today? A more critical type of decision would be a man overboard situation in maritime operations. The next characteristic of a decision is not only do you have a problem, but you have options available for what to do. If there's only one option for what to do, it's not really a decision. You just do it. For instance, I only have one pair of clean socks, so I'm going to wear them. But if there are multiple options, different ways you might solve the problem, then there's a choice that has to be made. And the choice is a decision. For instance, I've got blue socks, black socks, and argyle socks. Or I can do a Williamson turn, a round turn, or a racetrack turn in order to turn and go after the man overboard. So the decision is to make the choice among the options that are available to you. Now, judgment is often required. If it's all by the book, if there's a procedure, a checklist, then the decision is easy. But judgment occurs if the choice is not obvious among the different options. So this is where leaders really stand out. An example, okay, is, okay, I'm going to wear one blue sock and one argyle sock. Maybe not such a good decision, but it is a decision. Or I'm going to do a Williamson turn to starboard and go right back and get that guy. So that's what we've got going on. Okay.
Reed, why don't you discuss with us a little bit more about leadership in maritime operations?
Okay. Let me toss that one to Rich if I could.
Absolutely.
Sure. So in maritime operations, especially on shipboard, especially if you're a fresh third mate, coming right out of school, first time out at sea, the seasoned officer is going to take you underneath their wing, the chief mate, the captain. So you may be standing bridge watch out in open ocean, but you're coming into a high traffic scheme. And the captain will probably be up on the bridge, but he or she may let you and may allow you to run the vessel going through, and as he's watching you. So in that case, what's happening is that the captain is looking at your decision, but acting as a leader in case he or she has to take over because he's not feeling comfortable with your decision. And that may be the same thing in cargo operations. So leadership in maritime operations, especially with some of the new freshly minted licensed offices, or even as you're moving into your new position, may strictly be a role where they're guiding you and they're watching you and they're parting their experience on you through a mentoring type of situation.
Fantastic.
So,
and
go ahead.
No, I was actually going to ask you, Reed, discuss with us decision-making as a critical component of operations.
Well, we feel that that decision-making is really the most important component of all the leadership functions that you will learn or apply. In fact, understanding problems, options, and making choices is probably the key responsibility that you will have as a leader in the maritime industry. And then, of course, once you've made a decision, you've got to have the courage to act. Explaining these choices and actions clearly to subordinates is another key characteristic of leadership.
Now, when you're explaining to subordinates, how do you know how much to explain and when to stop explaining and just get the job done?
Right. Well, that's one of the other key characteristics of a good leader is you have to give them just the right amount of information. Don't overdo it because you want to get action going. But you also want them to understand commander's intent. You want the subordinates under you to know why you've made the decision, what you're trying to accomplish, so that if they run into problems or differences, they can work to your intent as well as to your orders. So let's talk for a minute about decision-making as a skill as we could. It's commonly held in the industry that good leaders, great leaders are just born that way. And while that's true, leadership can be what we call a talent and you just have it naturally. Our research has shown that good leaders can also be made. There are specific skills associated with leadership. These skills can be taught, they can be learned, and they can be applied. As we'll see in this discussion, experience plays a significant part in leadership and good decision-making. Experience can be gained. Good experiences and bad experiences are both important to improving your ability to make decisions. We all learn from our mistakes, as you already know by now. And experience can also be gained from others as well. You can gain experience from training, from hearing about experiences that others have had, from talking about it over a beer. And in fact, it's often best if we learn from the mistakes of others so we don't have to create them for ourselves.
Fantastic. And Rich, we have decisions we make in the maritime environment, both of us having a background in the maritime industry. Some are decisions that overlap with those we reach in our daily life, and some are not.
So, and you're correct on that. We make decisions every day, either on board ship or off board ship. And I think one of the best things that's been instilled in me since I've been out almost 30 years of maritime is one of the professors saying, and prime example is dressing for the weather. We make the decision of before we go to watch, before we wake up in the morning, or as we wake up, how do we dress? And I know myself, that's always stuck with me. Is it going to rain? Is it going to be cold? Is it going to go from cold to hot, hot to cold? You want to make sure you have enough and the proper clothing, especially on a ship, that, especially if you're on watch, you can't go back down to get, oh, I'm cold, I need to get my jacket. You should always think of that. And that's something important as we talk about in decision making, that we make these every day, and it's not based on, and most of them are based on our experience. We know that, and I'm going to use the dress for the weather because it's the simplest. We know the first time that you go up to watch and you get cold and you actually go back down and the captain finds out about it, you're going to get a little butt chilling because you left your watch. Well, guess what? That's an experience that we've had. And now we know that the next time I'm going to be well prepared before I go up there, and I'm going to find out this information before. And that's a lifelong trait that sticks with you, even when you're on ship or not off ship, because it's an experience we had and it's something we went through and we remember that. And so our decision has a consequence. So we don't, especially if it's a butt chewing, we don't want that consequence to happen again.
And, you know, that's very true. And you highlighted on a point which I instruct all my students in, and that is preparation. We are much better able to make decisions if we're prepared ahead of time to have to make that decision. Your example about the weather is perfect. Even in day-to-day maritime operations, when I was sailing as chief mate, do you paint today? Do you not paint today? What's the weather going to be like? Is it going to be rainy? Is it going to be hot and humid? Is it going to be cold? Or is the weather going to be just right for painting? These are some decisions that we make every day on a ship, as simple as painting or cleaning, what to clean, how to clean it. You know,
Exactly.
In critical operations, such as cargo operations, a decision is much more time sensitive, but just as important is which route decision you take. And here's a perfect example. I was on a vessel that was loading a 60-ton tank in the air down several decks through a tight hatch. Someone happened to step in the danger zone, which would mean if the cargo were to suddenly fall, they would be instantly crushed. Do I decide to move that person out of danger or stop the cargo operation to properly instruct them as to what to do? Obviously, with a 60-ton tank hanging in the air, I didn't stop the operation to give a proper instruction. I moved the person out of the way and instructed them and allowed cargo to resume. But this is one of many different critical decisions we have to make on the spot in the maritime environment. Now, Reed, we also have a lot of critical decisions we have to make in business, whether it's for crises or day-to-day operations. Isn't that right?
Yeah. In fact, there are really three types of critical decisions that you're going to be faced with in the maritime business. Now, you won't be faced with all of them, but they occur. The first kind is, as you just said, Matt, business decisions, those that help a maritime business succeed. An example of a critical business decision might be the price to charge for a cargo. Another might be the schedule for delivery of that cargo. Then there are operations decisions, those that make a voyage successful and safe. An example there might be the course and speed in a crowded waterway. And then finally, there are crisis decisions, those that manage and resolve a critical and urgent situation. And the urgency is important here. An example here is whether to evacuate in an onboard fire. So today, we're going to focus a little bit more on the crisis side of it because those decisions are the most urgent, the most critical, and often have the highest consequences.
Fantastic. So there's a science behind decision making and how people actually make decisions. And Rich, I know you know quite a bit about this. Maybe you could discuss that with us.
So the science is called recognition prime decision making, and a lot of the work was done by Gary Klein. Gary Klein wrote a book called Sources of Power, and in that book, he interviewed a lot of decision making, a lot of experience, and he was trying to figure out why these decisions were made at that specific point. why did a certain person, and there are multiple examples. One of the best examples that I can pick up is a structural firefighter. He was embedded with structural firefighters, and he went to fires with them. And there was one of his anecdotes is he's interviewing this lieutenant on his actions. So the lieutenant went into a house fire, and he starts putting water on a fire, but the fire is not acting in that way. It's not acting in the way that's expected. So the lieutenant backs everyone out, and the floor collapses. At that point, afterwards, Gary Klein is interviewing the lieutenant. Why did you make the decision? And it's through conversation where he realizes, well, I put water on it and the fire wasn't going out. It wasn't behaving the way it was. It wasn't as hot as it should have been. So as they start realizing is that through this lieutenant's experience, he was able to realize that he had that sixth sense, that intuition to say something is not right here. It's not behaving the way that it should be behaving. And that's the whole thing of recognition, prime decision making. It's that intuition to say, if I'm in this situation and I do this action, is it behaving the way I expect it to behave? And if not, I need to turn around and change my action and change my approach, because it could either be life-threatening or, especially in the maritime industry, it could be very costly.
Now, when we also talk about training people for decision making, some things that we use, Rich, are checklists and standard operating procedures. And how does that play a part?
Well, checklists are used, especially in high reliability organizations. They use checklists a lot because one error can cost a life or catastrophe. Well, let's look at a nuclear reactor or a nuclear ship. Everything is proceduralized. Why? Because everything must be step by step. We use them in multiple ways of either looking at them as a process, and we find that some of the greatest leaders out there, greatest judgment people, almost have the checklist memorized. They know what their next step is. But when you're dealing with something that is so critical, and I go back to a nuclear reactor, there is no leeway. So they always use the checklist. Sometimes you cannot get away from using the checklist only because of the task at hand. And then other times you realize that certain leaders just don't need a checklist in the situation that they're in, because they have the experience, so much experience with it, that they know what their next step is going to be.
That's a very similar analogy to the Miracle on the Hudson, with Captain Sullenberger actually knowing what steps to take and what steps in the checklist may have needed to be skipped in order to safely get the plane down and get people out.
Exactly. And if you look at the Captain Sullenberger, a lot of it was his experience as an Air Force pilot.
Exactly. Now, when we talk about decisions, critical decisions can be non-urgent as well as urgent, right, Reed?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, if there's time, information, and enough resources to spend the time working on a decision, then that's kind of in a non-urgent situation. In that kind of situation, we found psychologically that people use a particular approach to decision making. So one we normally see a lot in business. The name for this is rational choice. And in rational choice decision making, what we do is we define the problem precisely. Then you identify all of the options that are available for making the decision, for choices of action, every single one of them. Then you take each of those options and you characterize it fully. If one of my options is to take a particular action, then I'm going to go through that action, identify everything that's needed to do that action. What are all the resources, how I'm going to operate, what are the steps, what do I expect the outcomes to be, etc. And I do that for each one of the options I'm considering. Then I get together with my buddies and we do a thing called rank ordering. We identify the option that's the best, the option that's number 2, the option that's number 3 by applying some kind of criteria to them. Then we simply pick the one at the top of the list. the best performing option and we implement it. But there's a problem. When the situation is urgent, there's usually not the time, not the information, and not the resources to go about it that way. So what we really found out is that method can't be used when there's a crisis in play. What has happened is the human mind, over 100,000 years of evolution, has developed a completely different way of thinking when that occurs. When the decision is time critical, when data are incomplete, or the information that you're getting is suspect, when the consequences are really significant. Research has shown that humans operate in a particular way. And the way that they operate is they quickly identify the situation. They find the first available option that's going to work, and they put in that into play, and then they see how it's going to work. This is considered the natural way that humans operate when they're under stress. And there's now a pretty big body of research to tell us this is how we operate. You can probably recognize it in yourself as well. So the name that has been given to this kind of decision-making is called naturalistic decision-making. Now, one of the things that we know about this is that judgment and experience are critical characteristics of decision-making when you're in an urgent situation. So let me talk for just a minute about what judgment is. So judgment is when you make a decision objectively, authoritatively, and wisely. So authoritatively, you know, is a leadership function. Objectively is something that you learn to do. Wisely is important, and wisely is hard to get. How do you get wisdom? You get wisdom through experience, by making mistakes. And the more mistakes you make, the wiser you get. You all know this. I'm really wise because I made a lot of mistakes.
Now, Reed, doesn't that also assume that those making the mistakes actually learn from them?
Yes, and you have to do that because let's say that you make 10 mistakes. You might make the same mistake 10 times. You haven't really learned anything from that. But if you make a mistake and then you think about it, you internalize it, and you do something different next time, then you've learned from your mistake and you're in better shape from that. So you want to learn from those mistakes and also learn from the mistakes that others have made as well. Wisdom implies that you're using the knowledge and experience that you have to gain an understanding of what you're trying to do. And then you apply that understanding using common sense and insight. The insight goes back to a word that Rich used a few minutes ago, which is intuition. And intuition isn't really anything more than knowledge and experience that we put below the conscious level. And then we bring it back up when we need it. And that's called intuition. But it's really based on the experiences that we've had over time. Back to you, Matt.
So, for example, a situation that I experienced at one point as a mariner, I was on a tugboat pushing a barge into Point Judith, Rhode Island, and a small sailing vessel decided to cut across the channel only 150 feet across of our bow. We had a decision to make, very critical time decision to make. Do we alter course, keep going, and try and slow down? Now, this was a loaded barge of oil in a channel that was not very wide. If we altered course, it could mean dumping all of that oil into the water, causing a very bad environmental disaster, as well as injuring those on board the barge and the tug. Or do we keep going and hope that the sailing vessel will get out of our way with enough time? The captain at the time had enough experience and could recognize the situation, having experienced it before, to realize the sailing vessel, although close, was moving fast enough to clear us should everything remain stable. So we ended up going through this situation, and there were no problems, there were no injuries, no oil loss, nobody injured, but it was a close case scenario. And I think we sometimes have to recognize that with these decisions, there is still always a risk in making the right decision.
Absolutely. And what you need to do at all times, Matt, is once you make a decision and you implement it, that's really good because you want to act decisively. Then you watch it like a hawk. Your assumption at that point is I made a bad, after you've made it and you put it in place, your assumption is I made a bad decision. Let me figure out why as quickly as I can and do something different. And then if you made the right decision, it's all good. But you're kind of primed now to say, okay, why isn't this acting like I thought it would? So I'm going to do something different. And that lets you course correct, if you will, and continue on working toward better and better outcomes.
That's fantastic. So how does AlphaTrac actually work to improve this process?
So what we've done is we've conducted research on crisis decision making along the lines with others that Rich talked about a few minutes ago. This research really began about 20 years ago in response to the Vincennes accident, also the airline accidents and other cases that were going on. What they really did was interview, as Rich was talking about a few minutes ago, military commanders, airline pilots, firefighters, emergency room doctors, and nurses. And the conclusion they came to is when these folks are really good, when they're really good at acting in emergencies and crisis situations, they're all thinking the same way. Their situations are different, the decisions they have to make are different, but they're thinking the same way. And so they came out with these models that I talked about earlier, rational choice and naturalistic decision making, and determined that people who really make great decisions in crisis are using naturalistic decision making. Now, when we started working on this, we identified that the model of this, the cognitive model, if you will, of what is going on, that's used and seems to be most successful in people that are actually making crisis decisions, is a thing that Rich referred to, which is called recognition prime decision making, or shortened form, RPD. In recognition-based decision-making, the decision maker gathers key information about the incident that they're involved in right now. Whether it's a maintenance activity or whether it's a man overboard or a shipboard fire, it doesn't matter. They're going to gather the most important information. And that's critical to know because really good decision makers don't take in all the information. They know which pieces of information going by them to grab out of the air. Then they use that information that they're gathering to trigger recognition because they've had experience or because they've learned about the experiences of others. They do a pattern recognition activity right in their brain where they use the information about what's happening today, compare it to experiences they've had, bring up an experience that matches, and that's recognition. That leads them to a thing we call situational awareness. Oh, I know what's going on here. That's really critical because if you're solving the wrong problem, you're automatically going to be in bad shape. So the first thing to know is what's the problem? And oh, I recognize what I've got going on here because it's happened to me before or something similar has. Or I heard about it over that beer the other day. Okay, so they do that and then looking at what experience they've had before and looking at their SOPs and procedures, they identify the first good enough solution that may get this thing under control that you're dealing with, okay? The engine, the motor, the pump that they're working on is making a racket, okay? So what do I need to do? Do I need to shut it down or do I need to slow it down? You know, that sort of thing. So identify the first good enough solution and then they put it into play right away. They don't look for better solutions. This is part of naturalistic decision making. They put the solution into play right now, and then they watch it, as we talked about a few minutes ago, to see if it's working or if they need to really modify that situation. And they keep doing this until the problem is really resolved. And that's how the process works. So
fantastic. Rich, any final words or thoughts on your end?
Just one thing that comes back to me is that one thing that we jump on AlphaTrac or AlphaTrac, what we're working to do is that we also have what they call high consequence and low probability events. So one of the things that, how do you gain experience when you have events that don't happen that often, but that are high probability or not high consequences. So a lot of things can go wrong. So it's through training. It's through putting people through an environment to get them to think that way, to understand that through simulation, through other processes to gain it. So this is definitely a trainable process to get people thinking that way. It's just, you need the right tools.
Fantastic. Gentlemen, Rich, Reed, I'd like to thank you both very much. It's been very informative, fantastic, and hope we can do this again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.